Loot crates and boxes are quickly becoming more ubiquitous in video games, proving to be an extremely popular way for companies to separate their customers from their money, and an effective way to generate huge profits on top of the ever-increasing cost of developing games. Starting off as the business strategy of choice for free-to-play mobile games, a platform where asking customers to pay a straightforward price up front ensures your game gets buried underneath the heap of free games that get splurged onto the App Store every day. The loot box method is where the game encourages players to repeatedly pay small amounts for the randomised chance to unlock in-game items, such as weapons, currency, playable characters and cosmetics. The draw of this style of microtransactions comes from the randomness. Players who really want a specific item would otherwise be able to buy it for a small amount of money, but with the loot box system they have to keep paying for just the chance at receiving the item they want, often spending far more than it's worth and receiving only other items they didn't want and duplicates to show for it, keeping them coming back and spending more. Shortly after it proved to be so successful, loot boxes made their way to online multiplayer games, with companies justifying the idea as being necessary to pay for the continuous server upkeep that such games need. Players slowly grew more accepting of this and developed a commonly shared set of guidelines for what constitutes acceptable use of loot boxes, which game developers generally adhered to at risk of alienating their users. 1. Loot boxes should only contain cosmetic items, nothing that would give an advantage to paying customers, also known as pay to win. 2. There should be a way to obtain loot boxes in-game without paying, often at an extremely slow rate, but the option must be there. 3. All additional content that would have been released as DLC, such as map packs, should be free, with the cost being recouped by the loot boxes. Over time, loot boxes started becoming more and more popular in online games, often being retroactively patched into older games that didn't originally have microtransactions, such as Rocket League, Rainbow Six Siege and Call of Duty Modern Warfare. And developers started thinking they could get away with breaking one or two of the mitigating principles that players had come up with. Keys were introduced in some games to unlock the randomised crates, so although the crates could still be obtained by playing normally, the player would have to pay for the key, or be constantly reminded of their unopened goodies. Call of Duty Infinite Warfare suffered a hail of criticism upon release, but was notable in this regard for including both improved guns, only available from loot boxes, or supply drops as they're called in game, giving an unfair competitive advantage to players based on how much money they were willing to spend and how lucky they got with the randomised item drops, as well as further DLC maps in a £40 season pass. With the announcement that Middle-earth Shadow of War, sequel to the popular Shadow of Mordor, will contain loot chests, the practice has quickly made its way into its first major single-player game. Some people have been quick to defend the practice when applied to single-player games with the standard fare, if you don't like them, you can just ignore them. But I argue that the decision to put in loot boxes affects the entire game, not just the menus you use to buy them. Games are made more artificially challenging to force people to spend their money on loot boxes. The devs would never proudly admit it, of course, that would be a PR nightmare, but it's happened before with Dead Space 3 and Forza 4, and occasionally someone in the company will let slip that that's what's happened. In this case, it seems that grinding is used as the incentive to get you to spend money on crates, reducing the time spent doing a repetitive task in order to progress to the next enjoyable part of the game, much like the original free-to-play mobile games with wait timers that you can pay to skip. Ignoring the lack of faith in how enjoyable their core gameplay is that Shadow of War's devs think players will be happy paying to spend less time playing the game, another problem is that of immersion. In Shadow of Mordor, you recruit orc captains to your cause by dominating them and controlling their mind. In Shadow of War, you can still do that, but it's quicker and easier to hook up your debit card, load your game full of premium currency, open a load of loot crates and have your new orc captain pop up out of the box. Even overlooking how these games often feel the need to show in-your-face reminders and pop-ups that the loot boxes are there if you want them, this is immersion annihilating. Games are an immersive experience, a fantasy world, and microtransactions get in the way of that, pulling you out of the media you're enjoying in order to persuade you to spend money. It's important to remember that if you can say just ignore them to the loot boxes, or even if you're someone like me who might buy a few if you're enjoying the game and love the look of that skin, you're not the target audience.
The problem was when I went to bed and the very first thing I thought of the next morning was
boxes.
I want to open 50 more boxes.
Wow.
And at 9:21 a.m., I came over to this couch, sat down, and opened 200 more boxes.
So what's your playtime in the unboxing versus the shooter?
The vast majority of people who play mobile freemium games never pay a single cent. Just 0.15% of players make up over half of all revenue. These high spenders, referred to as whales, in the same way as those who lose big at casinos, are those susceptible to gambling addiction, the compulsive spenders, the completionists who have to get everything in the game. And now that loot boxes have progressed from mobile games to every type of games, the same problem has come to console. These people are the ones being targeted for microtransactions, and the game companies use every mental exploit they know to get them to spend. But why are loot boxes the method that's caught on? Jamie Madigan, a psychologist with an interest in video games, says that a lot of research shows that fixed rewards are not as effective for getting people to change behaviours, learn a new behaviour, or form a habit as random rewards are. Our brains are wired to try to make sense of unexpected things. When you have a random number determining what loot you get, by definition you're going to get an unexpected result or an unexpected predictable result every time. Whether you get that by playing the game for so many hours or winning so many matches, or whether you get a roll of that random number generator from spending $5 to buy a pack of cards or a loot chest, it's still the same rush, the same experience. This explains the large-scale design of the loot box system, encouraging the more susceptible to pay to speed up that next rush. But even in the more minor designs of the systems these games use, there are carefully planned tricks aimed to get players more excited about opening boxes. Like how in Overwatch, the colour of the rewards in the crate briefly flashes gold, the colour of the rarest items, before the item players actually got are revealed. In case it isn't obvious by now, I believe that loot crates are a form of gambling. It's not by any means a controversial opinion, but there are people who give the counterpoint that because, apart from the odd game, you can't win tangible money from randomised loot boxes, they don't meet the definition of real gambling. If I add back in the rest of the definition, you can see that the return stakes can be anything of value, not just money, and that's what people are paying for with loot boxes. They might win big by receiving the item they want, or they might lose their money by receiving duplicates or items they didn't want. The long and short of it is that both loot boxes and gambling are risking your money in a game of chance with the hope of a positive reward. There is also one area loot boxes are objectively worse than traditional gambling, and that is its regulation. Almost all countries have laws protecting those who take part in gambling from being taken advantage of or manipulated, and in the UK these boil down to three parts. Companies must be licensed and 1. Ensure no link between gambling and crime or disorder. 2. Ensure that gambling is conducted fairly and openly. 3. Protect children and vulnerable adults from harm or exploitation. No such rules are put in place for video game gambling, and without any oversight we get stories of children racking up thousands of pounds worth of microtransaction debt so often most of us are completely desensitised to them. Comparing loot boxes to their closest casino counterpart, the slot machine, we can see the difference this regulation makes. Slot machines work off a percentage called RTP, return to player, which is the total amount of money taken that must be given out again in winnings. Typically this percentage is 82% to 98% depending on region, the law determining what the minimum RTP can be while still being fair to the players. Even in countries without a minimum return percentage, the law will normally say RTP must be made clearly known to every player. In contrast, video game developers are notoriously guarded about the algorithms and return rates behind their loot boxes, treating the likelihood of getting each reward tier like closely protected secrets. Blizzard in particular pulled a masterclass of loophole excavation when China, of all places, introduced progressive legislation requiring publishers to, among other things, promptly publicly announce information about the probability of all virtual items and services. Fearing that having to continually reveal their statistics would affect microtransaction sales, Blizzard redesigned their entire store just for China, so that, for the same price as before, Chinese players would now be buying tiny amounts of in-game currency with free loot boxes thrown in, rather than just buying the boxes. Anyone who's played the game knows that 5 credits for $2 or 120 credits for $35 will buy you absolutely nothing, and that the loot box system remains the same in all but name. But that tiny change means they can keep their RTP secret. At the same time as all this is going on, there's an ongoing crackdown in gambling in video games. Ratings boards such as the ESRB and PEGI are given authority to restrict game sales to people over a certain age, in the form of the ratings symbols everybody recognises. No game can be sold in a region without the corresponding rating board's evaluation on a variety of content descriptors, including gambling, that advise what age group the game's content is suitable for. What then is the issue? In the words of PEGI, their gambling warning is for games that may contain elements that encourage or teach gambling. which basically means depictions of real-life gambling inside the game. Actual gambling of real money in the form of loot boxes isn't included as such, and so has no effect on the age rating of the game. This strictness on the depiction of gambling stems from the well-researched fact that adolescent and pre-adolescent people are more susceptible to the addictive potential and risks of gambling, with rates of problem gambling far higher in young gamblers than adult gamblers. By trying to increase the age video game players are exposed to gambling, the ratings boards hope to limit the appeal of the hobby and prevent children from taking part in it until they are fully neurologically developed. And it's working. America's ratings board, the ESRB, restricts games with a minigame degree of gambling prominence, such as Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch, Stardew Valley and Professor Layton and the Last Spectre, to ages 10 and up. With any game focusing on realistic depictions of casino games, poker, blackjack or slot machine simulation games, getting a seemingly automatic teen, 13+, rating. PEGI, the UK's rating board, has a seemingly more lenient classification for their equivalent gambling category, with Ni no Kuni, and its comparatively fleshed out casino, the only one of those 3 games to receive it. However, any game assessed as containing gambling in the UK is compulsorily restricted to at least a 12+ age limit, with the option to go up to 15+ or 18+. The elements that teach gambling clause also means that games that are staunchly anti-gambling, such as Persona 5, anyone who's played The Final Palace knows why I say that, still receive the warning. One key difference between the ESRB and PEGI system, as well as most other countries' equivalent, is that it's actually illegal to sell games to those under their respective age rating, carrying the massive maximum penalty of 6 months in prison and a £20,000 fine, with similar laws elsewhere. People under the age limit still find ways around that, of course, like the scores of preteens that play Call of Duty online every day, but that huge loss of sales that comes from limiting their target audience means that it's often just easier from a business sense for developers to not tackle any gambling related topics because of the risk of losing out a huge chunk of profit, especially in the case of games like the one I've mentioned, where their primary audience is children. In 2007, PEGI changed their rules to be stricter on gambling depictions, causing the Pokemon developers Game Freak to hurriedly remove slot machines from Pokemon Platinum's European version, worried that the game would be given a revenue-ruining higher age rating, and from then on, deciding that maintaining multiple versions of the game for different countries' classification standards was too much work, the Games Corner, a feature from the very first game, has been cut. The Games Corner was even removed from remakes of earlier games, except for the Virtual Console release of the first generation games, which kept it in at the expense of getting the 12+ rating. These regulations prove that gambling in video games is known to be harmful by the boards that decide what age rating to assign games. So much so they've influenced video game writers to change their games to avoid even featuring gambling as a concept for fears it would influence young gamers. Yet there is no oversight for games that use lootbox microtransactions as a business model. By structuring the gambling around the game, even while using real money rather than fictitious depictions of money, companies circumvent the age restrictions on video game gambling. I believe that with how effective certain randomised microtransaction methods can be at targeting an audience open to exploitation, they should be taken into consideration when rating a game, possibly under the gambling descriptor or as its own new category. I don't think that will entirely solve the problem, nor do I think that the games industry would give up on a method that has proven to be so profitable, but with events such as the still ongoing case of popular YouTubers scamming their mostly preteen audience using loot crate rewards, and the ever-expanding scope of games that include loot boxes, it's clear that unless something is done, the problem isn't going away anytime soon.